So today's session is on the globalization, secularization, and transformation of faiths. And we don't have Tony Blair with us. We don't have a additional resource person with us, so you're kind of stuck with me and with Doug for this course. What I'll try to do is maybe offer just a bit more extended introductory comments on the topic, and then open it up for discussion. And this may be an opportunity also to kind of range a bit more broadly in terms of your questions about faith than just the topic of this session, that is to look back as well as maybe anticipate the future. And then I thought what I might do in the second part of this session is to take the question that has surfaced very prominently and very quickly and very prominently in the session one session we had with Tony Blair, and that is the question of religious exclusivism and the relationship between religious exclusivism and kind of promotion of pluralism as a social value or as a political project. Relationship between exclusive religious claims and pluralistic environments in which we find ourselves and which globalization processes are increasingly creating. So I've developed some comments on this. It was an essential element, almost red thread of discussions last year. It started, I think, was the first session that was raised, just like you did, which we should have then built in reading about it and time for reflection on this. We didn't, but as it turns out, we'll have probably 35, 40 minutes on that if that's what that's as long as you want to deal with the issue. So first, we talked a bit about significance of faith. I don't need to repeat any of this. And we are obviously when we're dealing with the question of secularization and transformation of faiths, we're obviously dealing with the future of faiths in the globalized world. And that future concerns questions of religious adherence. Do faiths continue to claim the hearts and minds of people around the globe as much as they did in the past, for instance? That's a question that we need to answer, and the answer is yes. In particular, Islam and Christianity, Buddhism, these three faiths are growing in numerical terms, in relative and absolute terms, as I said previously. Will they do so in the future? Well, they're most likely. If we extrapolate on the basis of data that we have now, it's likely it's going to continue to be that way. What will those numbers be? Oh, it's tough to say. But it does look like in immediate future, at least, the world's going to get to be a bit more, for some of you I should say, even more religious place than it is right now. Now, the connected question to this is not just that of religious, we're interested not just that in religious adherence, we are also interested in role of faith in public realm. Are faiths a force that shapes realities beyond people's private and narrowly communal lives? And we've seen previously arguments which would suggest no, faiths are something very much private. Faiths are, if you want, even epiphenomenal. They don't shape anything. They're shaped by something, conditioned by other things, but they themselves are, some people would even argue strongly, causally inert. They don't do anything, right? They just come to surface given certain conditions, right? I'm not sure that I'm pretty sure that that's not quite right, but at least that's one of the possibilities. And if they are shaping realities beyond private and narrowly communal lives of people, will they continue to do so in the future? And in what ways faiths will be significant, right? And then there's a question also of the character of faiths. How is the character, very form that faiths take, being shaped by globalization processes? And given that fates are being shaped by globalization processes, if they indeed are, how do the influences go in complex ways? So that's roughly what we're going to be talking about. But first, few comments on secularization. So, and I want to give you mention a few aspects of secularization. Often when we talk about secularization, it ends up, we end up talking past each other because secularization, word secularization, is used in at least three distinct ways. And it's important to know what we are how we are using the word when we are using it. So first sense of secularization is differentiation of secular spheres, which is to say differentiation of society, and within that society, emancipation of, say, state, of economy, of media, broad spheres of life, from immediate or from even mediate influence of religious institutions and possibly even religious norms. Now, obverse of this is what sociologists call privatization of religion. That is, if religion is not shaping how state is being run, how economy is being run, well, then religion is increasingly has become a private affair of individuals. So that's secularization in one sense, this differentiation, right? Second sense in which secularization is used is simply decline of religious belief and practice. People are simply turning away from belief in God, and people are turning away from religious practices. And there may be discrepancies there, right? Many people can say that they believe in God, but they don't attend worship services, or if they attend worship services, it doesn't very much matter in their lives. So various ways in which this decline of religious belief and practice can be expressed. And then final sense is change in conditions of belief. And this has been introduced in a book, most compellingly in the book, this idea has been introduced most compellingly in the book by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. It's a kind of doorstopper book. It can inflict serious damage if you wield it in appropriate or inappropriate ways. And it's a long, windy story which Charles Taylor tells, but he's one of the great philosophers of our time, and this is really one of great books on secularization issue. But his question is, how did we come to move away from a society where belief in God was unchallenged and unproblematic, something like 1500s, right? To a society or to a cultural environment in which faith is understood to be one option among others, and often an option which is not the easiest one to embrace. So he's asking conditions of belief, and conditions of beliefs have shifted and changed in such a way that you have to choose that faith among multiplicity of options rather than kind of slipping into it as a state of normalcy in which society operates. Now, we will be interested primarily in the first two aspects of secularization, in decline of individual religious practice, and belief can be seen as an aspect of practice, and second, in decline of cultural influence of faiths. Though I don't think we should bother too much with the question about the future of religion. And often secularization is discussed in those terms, right? And some people then expect eventual demise of religion, almost like as a matter of linear understanding of history. It's part and parcel of the philosophy of history that religion ought to, or that religion will experience demise, or as kind of conjectural extrapolation from data, and we're not so much interested in that, not just because this is not easy to answer this question, but because I think for the purposes of this course, it's not necessary for us to answer this question. We're talking about next decades. We're not talking about ultimate future of religion. So let's now look at the relationship between globalization and secularization. Now, one thing I think is right to say is that globalization is and entails modernization. Right? Globalization is fueled, maybe primarily driven by modern market system. It's mediated and helped by technological advancements, especially advancements in communication, but other also technological advances. And I think globalization is assuming, and it's also reinforcing what sociologists call individuation. So to say that individual is, you've seen that, I think Berger mentions that, individual is taken out of sort of traditional given identities and thrown on his or her own resources to make choices about life. And globalization also means rather fast-paced fashioning and refashioning of alternative, almost global culture. I think something's happened in the global level that's moving very fast in terms of cultural change. So all of these elements, I think, are elements of modernization. But now the question is whether modernization entails secularization. And alternative one is to say modernization, to modernize is to secularize. And if modernization entails secularization, decline of religion in society, decline of religion in the minds of individuals, then obviously globalization too will entail secularization. If religions survive, then they survive because they're holding onto something from the past, either because modernization hasn't progressed far enough yet, or because of social inertia. All resurgence of religion can be kind of last gasp of religion before its final demise. Law professor here, for whom I have great admiration and who's my friend, Tony Kronman, in conversations with him, he basically expressed this opinion. What you see, this religious resurgence, is a kind of last gasp of religion before, it gives out its ghost. The other alternative is modernization is not necessarily secularization, which means that there might be religious ways to be modern. Embracing secularism is one way to modernize. Embracing faiths and holding on to faiths may be an alternative way to modernize. We'll encounter this concept of alternative modernities in the next session, especially the work of Jose Casanova, who will be our guest here. And I would encourage you to read carefully the text assigned for the next week, his text assigned for the next week. I think that's one of the best kind of sociological analysis of what's happening in the world of religion today. Charles Taylor himself is a strong and sturdy, both mainly philosophical advocate, but also sociological advocate of alternative modernities. So if there are such alternative modernities, if there are religious ways to modernize, then obviously globalization need not lead to secularization. But as I sometimes say, globalization can be played in multiple different registers. There are different religious registers in which globalization can be played, and there's also secular, presumably also multiple secular registers in which it can be played, depending on the particular culture in which, through which globalization processes refract themselves. So, but the question for us is not simply whether it's possible for religion to live together with advancing globalization processes, and my argument would be that secularization thesis has proven not to be correct, at least for now. But also, what might be the impact of globalization processes on the shape which religions take? And so I want to talk about now about globalization's impact on faith. And there are a few points that I want to make here. One of them being globalization and the conditions under which people embrace faith. Globalization and the form which faiths take. Globalization and the modes of transmission of faith. And globalization and the modes of religious influence, shaping the way religious influence takes place. Okay. So overarching conditions under which people embrace faith. And often it boils down to something like a malcontent with globalization processes, or with life in general, right? All these religious people. Actually, that'll be too. I can give a whole lecture about the positive experience of life in association with embrace of religion, but we'll keep that maybe for another class, another course. For instance, people experience themselves as left out from globalization's benefits, and they're seeking consolation in faith, or possibly seeking inspiration to change the rules so as to attend to the losses of the so-called losers. A variation of that is kind of experience of injustice as a consequence of globalization, and maybe finding in faith assurance of future justice, or seeking motivation in faith to struggle for justice. You know, this idea of finding assurance in faith of future justice, this is very, very interesting how it emerged immediately after World War II, and among some very prominent Jewish thinkers. And the basic idea, the basic intuition was it's somehow unacceptable that the torturer would eternally triumph over the victim. Some kind of sense of that immense, right, defeat that Holocaust was, and the immense wrong that it was, and somehow crying for justice, a search for justice. Max Horkheimer, it's a very interesting small book, Sehnsucht nach dem ganz anderen, the longing for a radically different one, right? Is that a good translation, Aaron? Okay. Third reason for embrace faith, believing that globalization undermines local cultures and seeking affirmation of local cultures through faith. See that very easily in former Yugoslavia, right? Not so much, partly connected with globalization processes, how faith attached itself to particular ethnic identities. Or experiencing disorientation in globalization. It's kind of being caught in the widths of globalization can feel like being in a swirling storm and then seeking guidance and certainty in faith. Or sensing the meaninglessness of the ends prevalent within globalization processes and seeking meaning in faith. I'm not suggesting that all people do that, but some religious people, that's how they experience globalization and therefore seek meaning in faith. Or believing that globalization, driven by market forces, undermines human flourishing by overprivileging, say, consumerism and simply reinforcing rather than shaping human desire, something of that sort. And then seeking alternative modes of human flourishing in faiths. B, globalization is shaping the very form which faith takes. It's an interesting phenomenon is democratization of faith. So it's steady growth in the processes of internal democratization of faith, subversion of authoritarian forms of faith, and even the forms of faith which have a strong authority structures, nonetheless incorporate in its own internal structure democratic elements. Non-authoritarian governments and active participation. Especially interesting here is inclusion of women in leadership roles and empowerment of women in leadership roles. Then also what's happening is that faiths tend to be demoored from particular locales, and they tend to become global faiths. Or put it differently, it's only easily transportable global faiths that seems to be surviving best adapted to the world caught in globalization processes. Somewhat in tension with this is the idea of rediscovery of culturally specific forms of faith. And you can see how globalization processes might require, might threaten cultural identities, and faiths may then take forms that are culturally specific. And then interesting phenomenon, and we touched briefly on this, is smorgasbord religiosity. Especially you find it in Western culture or in kind of higher echelons of global culture. It's kind of individually created faith tailored to individual needs. You've got nuggets of wisdom from here and there. You combine those, you are then Jubu, right? Is that, or whatever else combination you can attach. It's probably that's not exhaustive description, right? Of that, and there are other permutations and combinations of faiths, and they're tailor-made to a particular person, and they change also over time. How your needs change, so your religious sensibilities and what you find useful from different religious traditions, so that changes as well. And they're containing generally kind of no overarching interpretation of reality. They tend to be more kind of spiritualities which energize, which calm and soothe, but rather than kind of order the world as traditional faiths did. And they have often relatively highly attenuated sense of ultimacy. It's not that you have some sturdy divinity up there, right? But rather you're finding the God in the self that somehow is in each individual, again, divinities tailor-made to the self. C, globalization is shaping modes of transmission of faith. You know, just go back a little bit about the smorgasbord religiosity. It also turns faiths into kind of a lifestyle choice that cannot be contested by others. In other words, takes the faith out of the domain of truth claims. Claims about what is true and claims about what is good. Traditional faiths, they generally understand themselves as containing claims about the world that are considered to be true, and moral claims also. Smorgasbord religiosity is a more kind of a lifestyle religiosity. There are preferences in the ways in which we seek to conduct our lives with kind of a bit of religious aura to them. That's one way to put it. Globalization is shaping modes of transmission of faith, technologies of delivery. Faiths are as present on internet and as they were when radio was invented, as they were when TV was in its heyday. If TV evangelists notorious as they were ubiquitous. I remember the first time when I came to this country, and I came as a student of theology, you know, very religious person. I was, and I stayed with the family and flipped through channels, and came across this guy whose name was Ernst Angley. dressed in this flamboyant dress with the toupee on his head, walking in this kind of half airy way, and then coming to people and taking ghosts out of their evil spirits out of their ears. And I looked, my goodness, where have I landed? I thought, is this religiosity in America, right? Wow. Everything's possible, but then pretty soon you realize that the America is the land of extremes, right? And everything in between also. It's so technologies of delivery, right? New technologies of delivery, which I think feeds also into democratization of religions, with very little formal authority, or authority that is earned in act, right? So the authority that is transmitted through mass media often is precisely such kind of authority, especially through internet, right? New missionary movements from east to west, not just from west to east. We're used to kind of thinking of Christianity as a missionary religion and goes from west to east. The missionary movements goes the other way around. Buddhism, spread of Buddhism, for instance, is a very good example of that. Or the mission goes from non-Western to non-Western country. There's more missionary activities of Christians between non-Western countries than between West and the Western countries. And then Peter Berger has emphasized that, and also kind of the response to Peter Berger in part by Hans Joas, transmission of faith in the context of competitive religious pluralism. Right? There's religious pluralism, there's competition, and those are the conditions for transmission. And then finally, globalization is shaping modes of religious influence, which is to say how globalization is shaping the way in which faiths engage globalization processes themselves. One option is more traditional one, religious authority representing an institution acting globally, right? For instance, when Pope Benedict XVI speaks, that's how he acts. When Dalai Lama speaks, that's probably how he acts as a religious authority. But the other option is increasingly prominent and significant. Informal religious authority in the network of believers. And is kind of shaping subcultural movement of global dimensions. Bin Laden is a good example, right? Or take it to American scene. Most influential religious figure in America is arguably Rick Warren, right? But his authority is clearly the authority of his books. He has no formal authority at all, except maybe in his own Saddleback Church, and yet his authority stretches not just in this country, but around the globe. That too is made possible, I think, by modernization and globalization processes. I'll stop here and opening it up for comments, questions on what we've been discussing now, or also a bit broader about religion or about this course. Okay.